Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
We decided to talk about what it's like to get back into work after a break like the New Year's break. Just the kind of getting your brain back into that space, into like the pace of work. And then once you finally get there, how do you decide even what to tackle? Because chances are, after a big vacation or after the holiday break, holidays are especially bad at it, but after these things, we tend to have a lot of stuff piled up. A lot of things that we need to address, work that accumulated while we were gone, things that we should probably get going on. And so there's a bit of a tricky question about how do you prioritize those things? And then once you get going with working, how do you get going? How do you begin work? And then after that, I think we want to talk a little bit about how do we plan kind of the first few months of the year. That in the case of a New Year's break like this, there's a lot of things about the corporate world that go by years, things like, ad budgets, PR needs, everything else we talked before about seasonality. And so the first few months of the year is an interesting time to plan for, to get things done, to consider, what to work on, whether to release things, and everything else. So we're going to get into all of that. Dave, are you back to work yet?
Yes, only just. I think I essentially did. It's kind of a strange end of the year because I was launching a new app, which I usually don't like to do that time of year. But for this particular time, I'd hoped originally to launch Workouts++ in probably November or something, but it just didn't end up working out. The project took longer than I'd originally expected. And so it was, launched, I think it was December 21st or something, which is not advisable. It'd be especially because you kind of go through the process of launching something, you get it out, and then all of a sudden you have a lot of, delightful, but just sort of distracting family obligations and things such that, I really sort of put myself, it's almost like I just took this app, threw it over a wall into the world, and then just ran away for a couple days, which is not exactly what you want, and I did my best. I checked into the support thing every now and then, and, there were a few little initial bug fixes that you inevitably have. I was able to get those put together, and they're currently waiting in review. But then you just kind of fall off the map in a good way. And I think it's probably also good to start this discussion off by saying that taking breaks and having periods of time when you're not working is desirable, is a good thing. It's a bit of a problem that we're kind of looking at it from the perspective now of how do you deal with that when you come back to work. But there's certainly an advantage to having that separation, to take some time away, both in terms of your just mental health and overall well-being, and also probably just to build a little bit of perspective, to come back to things and be like, what do I actually want to work on? What was I doing before that I was just doing out of inertia rather than out of desire? But for me, now I'm back working again, and it's especially weird for me right now because I'm coming back at it after essentially skewing all work on my side project, on all my other apps except for Workouts++ for the last 2 or 3 months. So I gotten all those apps into a pretty good state, roughly with the launch of iOS 10. I'd done, I'd done a big update and then a bug fix update for most of my apps around iOS 10. They were all in a good place. Then I go off and work on Workouts++ for a couple of months. And now I'm in a place where I have to look at all my work and say, what do I actually want to work on next? What should I work on next? And I do find it really awkward and tricky when you end up it's the paradox of choice, I think it's called, or just being overwhelmed, more simply, where you look at all of the universe of things that you could do and having to try and understand what the right thing to do. And especially when you have to deal with these weird tensions between what do I think is the best thing financially for my business for me to do? What thing would I enjoy most working on? What thing do I think my customers are most expecting? Where should I go in terms of what project do I think I would learn the most from? There's lots of different reasons. And I, my first day back, which I think was on, I guess the day after New Year's Day, whatever that is, January 2nd, January 3rd, looking at I just sat down and opened up OmniFocus for the first time in a long time. Because when I'm in a period where I'm working on an app like WordPress++, like in a pretty focused manner, if I come across any things in my other apps, or I get feature requests or things that sound good, I just kind of throw them all into there, which I think is, a sane system to just kind of, rather than thinking about them and trying to manage them as you go, just, postpone that until it's time. That meant that, this week I've been having to sit down and be filter through just page after page of ideas, of thoughts, of things. And in general, I think my approach to this kind of thing is I just tend to latch on to one or two things that I think I can reasonably make progress with. And in some ways, this kind of makes me think of, I used to run track in high school, and it's like the warm-up lap. It's before you actually can start working properly, you have to go out and do a little bit of work, but not really hard work, just a little bit of something to get you back into the flow of things. And so, today I've been working on a little, it's like a minor feature in Pedometer++, that I think is useful and good and isn't a particularly high stress or high risk feature, but it's something that I think would be useful, and I can kind of go through the process of working on something again, get back in the flow, and then once I finish once I finish my warm-up lap, I expect to then dive into some of the bigger features and some of the bigger tasks that I think are going to take more of my mental energy, take more of my focus, and the kind of things that I don't really want to do cold after spending a week or two with very little work.
One of the challenges I face in getting warmed up, as you put it, the warm-up lap was great. One of the big challenges I face is that when you've been away from a project for a while, whether that's just a 5-day weekend and where your mind's totally somewhere else, or whether it's something like a big break where you're working on something else for a little while and you got to sideline something else. One of the big challenges I have is knowing where to even start, because this is the kind of problem where people like us who are indie developers who don't really work with other people, where basically the job of everything falls on us. It's very easy to get lazy with your organizational system about things like your to-do list, your tracking of what you have to do next, and also documentation of things like your code and your app and what these things do, what these different parts do. It's very easy to fall into the trap of, well, it's all in my head as I'm working on it, and I can just remember these things. So I don't need to write this down. I don't need to document this code. I don't need to manage a to-do list because I know what I have to do. And I am guilty of this worse than anybody else. I hardly ever write anything down. I keep only a very basic to-do list in TaskPaper of things I want to do for this version, and the entire Overcast 3.0 to-do list is something like 20 lines long. This is not a very granular thing to do most of the time. And towards the end I'll have a bug punch list basically that's a little bit more granular, but otherwise most of the time I'm working on something I don't have anything like that. It's just kind of all in my head. So when I'm facing this problem, my biggest challenge is just I know what I have to do. I have to keep things more documented. I have to keep my to-dos more organized, but I don't usually do it, or I do it to a very half-hearted degree, and it's more of a challenge of personal discipline than anything else. Of just when you're solo, it's so easy to not do things the way that you have to. When you work in a job with other people, you kind of always have to be writing things down and coordinating to-dos and having a roadmap, because it's kind of impossible to work with the people without having some degree of that. And there's also usually a well-working place should usually be at least somewhat prepared for somebody leaving or quitting or getting fired at any time, and other people being able to pick up their work where they left off. And when you're a solo developer like us, it's so easy to not have those kind of safeguards because you think you don't need them. But whenever you have to take any kind of break or juggle multiple projects, you really do need to think about those exact same strategies.
Yeah, and I actually was bit by exactly that the last day or so, where in this work that I've been doing on Pedometer++. So I haven't worked on the app for probably since October, I think. So like 2 or 3 months. And I sit down and I start using it. And I noticed something weird going on in my like data system where a certain iOS API call wasn't returning the values that I expected it to. And so I started looking into this and I was like, man, this is really weird. Like, it's a one of these weird edge case bugs where if I give a certain value to the HealthKit API, I get no data back. But if I do lots, sort of other things, it works fine, which is a really weird bug. I'm like, man, this is strange. And I spent about a half a day working on this bug, seeing if I can, find a workaround, if I can avoid it. In the end, I found I found no solution, and I was like, all right, well, I should probably use file a radar about this just to make sure that Apple knows that this is a bug. And I open up bugreport.apple.com, go into my little account, and one of the top radars in there was me reporting this exact bug in August of last year, which I think I was reporting it against like beta 2 or beta 3 in iOS 10. Clearly,
that's
I
awesome.
had completely forgotten that I'd done this exact process before. Which is a great example, though, of this, like, I just wasted half a day trying to track this thing down that a few months ago, I did exactly the same thing. And I suppose it is such a tricky thing, though, to want to document in great detail all of these kinds of things, because it is so easy to rely on your own memory. And, like, I think in many ways, I find really, like, one of the core skills of development is memory, where like I am at my most effective programming, the more of an application I can sort of hold in my head at once, where I know where all the features are, I know how they all interconnect, and having that kind of like loading all that information into my brain is like where it gets really efficient and helpful, where I'm not like constantly, command Fing all over the whole project, trying to find the various things. Like I just know where they are. But if you take a few months off, and you come back to a project, you can find yourself in these situations where like you just forgot that you've solved this problem, or you've gone through all of the work to determine that no solution exists. And like in this case, it's like what I really should have done when I solved this the first time, or ran into this problem the first time, is I should have just had a little comment in my code that said, this API fails in this way, radar filed, here's the radar number, for my own reference, just so that, it's like when I could, this morning, when I ran into this, I could thank past Dave for going back there, reporting this, short-circuiting this whole thing, and knowing that, like, okay, yeah, it's a bug, it's filed. Apple hasn't fixed it yet, but I can move on and don't need to worry about it, or at least I already did worry about it. But that discipline about that is, I think, really hard because, yeah, it doesn't feel like. I think it's really difficult to judge how far into the future you're going to need to know where you are. And on the flip side, obviously, you could take the other extreme and get really carried away and be documenting everything, and all of everything is like super detailed, and you end up in like a formal like software model where you have like the requirements, and then you have the development, and you have the testing documents, and like you can go way overblown as well. But there is definitely something that experiences like I had today definitely reinforces for me, where like I need to be a little bit more. And honestly, it's probably the kind of thing where just being like 10% more descriptive in my Git commits, in my comments, would have a disproportionate impact in my ability to come back to work and to feel that I understand what's going on.
It's almost like a hierarchy of caches. It's like in programmer terminology, it's like, we all know that, as you said, like when you have a whole bunch of the program in your head, you are way more effective. That's what we refer to when we're talking about being in the zone as programmers. Like it's basically having a whole bunch of the program in your head, which is like the highest level cache, like the L1 cache or the registers. And then as things like get evicted from either time or crowdedness, you have to start relying on other things to keep this stuff in your head, or to refer to other resources to get it back in your head. And a quick little comment in the code or good documentation of like the architecture of the code is way more effective at like when you have a cache miss in your brain and you have to go fetch it from this external resource. That's way faster than like having to repeat 8 hours of coding only to make the same mistakes over and over again, only to discover the same eventual truth at the end that you could have discovered with a quick little comment in the code.
Yeah, and it's in many ways, it reminds me of some advice I remember hearing once about when you're like writing little to-dos for yourself, like if you're capturing those kinds of thoughts, of the importance of capturing complete thoughts, not things that would just make sense at the time. So like if I record a little to-do that says, it's like table view height adjustment, like at that moment, I may know exactly what that means. And it sounds completely silly to have it, like fully expanded out, like table view height adjustment in stat screen of pedometer ++. Like that, if I don't include all those other nouns, I'm going to come back to that later and be like, what does this mean? Like it becomes just complete gibberish and garbage, even though at the time it feels like completely unnecessary because I understand entirely the context. And so I think in the same way, it's like when you're writing to-dos, it's important. And then, similarly with, in your code or your internal documentation. And I mean, obviously we have the benefit though, I will say, of we just have to write things that make sense to us. That we know ourselves better. It's not like we're trying to write something that anybody with any level of sophistication or understanding would be of the project or of programming in general would be able to pick up. Like we know ourselves, we know what, like what shorthands and what terms and things we can just use. But I think it's very important to have that kind of perspective of like, how can I be kind to my future self in my current self, rather than just assuming that my future self will like kind of work it out.
Oh yeah, because like especially like as the amount of time extends, if you're writing something for your future self of 4 days from now, that's very different from your future self of 4 months from now or 4 years from now. And as like I think it very quickly gets to a point that this is not like a slow progression. I think even after a few weeks or a few months of not working on something, you approach it almost as if a stranger would approach it. Like your future self is way less familiar with what you're working on right now than your present self might realize. And if you can kind of get that into your head and internalize that and start remembering that as you're doing this kind of documentation or prep work or anything like that, you can really save your future self a lot of hassle, because your future self is going to look at your current code and projects almost as if a stranger were looking at them. Anyway, our sponsor this week is somebody who never takes a break, because they're a hosting company, and you want your hosting company to never take breaks. It's Linode. Linode gives you fast, powerful hosting for your projects that you can set up in just seconds. They have easy-to-understand tools to let you choose your resource levels and Linux distros, giving you the power and flexibility you need. And Linode plans start at just $10 a month for a 2 GB RAM Linux server in the Linode cloud. Linode, I mean, this is the best stuff I've ever used in the web hosting world. I'm telling you, I've used a lot between all the different things I've worked on. I've used a lot of web hosting. I've used literally hundreds of servers in web hosting, and Linode is by far my favorite. And now I think almost everything I have is there now. And the only things that aren't there are things I just haven't gotten around to moving there yet, because moving things is a pain. But if you're looking for a new web host, or if you're willing to go through the hassle of moving to a new web host, I'm telling you, you're not going to be sorry with Linode. It is amazing. Their control panel is great. Their performance per dollar is, I think, unmatched in the industry. Highly, highly recommended. Anyway, it's never been easier to launch a Linode cloud server. They offer the fastest hardware and network with fantastic customer support behind it all if you need it. Even on the holidays, even on Christmas Day, New Year's Day, they are working. They are there. Linode guarantees 99.9% uptime for serverability. Once your server is up, they intend to keep it that way. And then, this is great for things like running your own private Git servers, hosting a large database, running mail servers, hosting an entire web app like what David and I do, and so much more. So as a listener of this show, if you sign up at linode.com/radar, you will not only be supporting us, but you also get $20 towards any Linode plan. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, there's nothing to lose. So go to linode.com/radar to learn more, sign up, and take advantage of that $20 credit, or use the promo code RADAR2017. That's RADAR2017. At checkout. Thank you so much to Linode for supporting this show.
So I think it's also probably fair, now that we've kind of come back into our work, to discuss and work through a little bit of what makes sense to plan out for the first part of the year. Because we've maybe talked about it before, where like iOS development has a schedule and a cadence kind of dictated to it somewhat externally, where, starting around June 1st or so, we get into the new stuff cycle, where from June till about September, we'll have new iOS betas, new devices, new whatevers that are going to be announced. The fall is the kind of fallout from that period, where we start to, all these things actually go out into the wild, and we get to see how they get used in practice. And then we kind of get into this next phase, which I think is in some ways my most enjoyable part of the cycle, where, from roughly now, we've gotten through Christmas and New Year's. So from now until June, we have about 6 months to just work on whatever we want in a lot of ways. And I tend to like this time of year for polishing, doing a lot of like 0.1, 0.2 releases, working on a lot of things that didn't make sense to try and squeeze in with a major iOS update, the things like that, where I can sit down and I can spend a significant amount of time without quite the same time pressure, as I would if I was doing it over the summer or in the fall. Where now I can kind of, if it ends up taking an extra couple weeks, it's fine. There's no external constraints or things that I'm trying to fight around. And so I tend to look at it, and that's kind of like what my planning right now for all of my apps. It's like essentially I'm just going to be sitting there making out these kind of big point releases for all of my apps. I have taken these kind of nice features that I think are value adds. And honestly, even a lot of what ends up happening with me is because I have so many apps, but they're all kind of related. All my plus apps are health and fitness oriented. And so what I've started to do too is I'll end up doing something in one of them that I feel like will make sense to kind of incorporate back into the other ones. And so I expect to be doing a lot of that this sort of, I guess, what we're going to call this period, like in the new year / to through the spring. Where I can go through and kind of just get everything in a nice, solid, robust, kind of like making these features a little bit deeper. Like maybe that's a good way to think of it too. Like in the summer and fall, I tend to think of it as kind of widening the apps, making them incorporate these new features, incorporating these new platforms, whatever makes sense. And then, sort of the first half of the year is more about taking those things and kind of digging them deeper and adding all those, the little touches that make the app richer that didn't quite have time to do in the first place.
Yeah, because the fall is, we spend so much of the fall and the summer even just like adapting new things or adopting new things and keeping up with all of Apple's new stuff. And from January through June, Apple's pretty quiet usually, and so yeah, it's a great time, as you said, like to work on quality, to broaden your feature base. I would say it's a great time to address things like user requests, like feature requests from people that are very common, like because you don't have anything else for the most part competing with this time. Most of the rest of the year, you have like external pressure of things you need to be keeping up with or doing or planning for right now. This part of the year is basically like work on the core, make the app better, make your stuff better. Try, if you want to start experimenting with brand new features or start planning what your next big release might be, this is a good time for that. Of course, I'm following none of this advice myself. I'm actually, of course, preparing to launch my 3.0 now, but that's not because it was planned this way. It's because it took too long. I wanted to launch it in the fall, and I just didn't. But this is, and honestly, this is not a bad time to release a big 0.0, a big 0.0 update, because there's not a lot else going on, and there is some concern there that you need to be aware of things like the PR seasons and calendar and advertising and everything like that. One of the good things is that, well, a good thing if you're looking to buy ads or things like App Store search ads, or ads on people's podcasts or ads on websites or whatever else, Facebook ads. Usually, ad inventory is pretty low in January and February. And this is a terrible thing if you make your money via ads, as you taught me, and you were right, that basically your ad revenue tends to drop pretty sharply in the first few days of January compared to the year before, and compared to the week before, even like in December, and sometimes it takes like big corporate ad budgets a little while to get organized and start buying things for the new year. And so if you are an indie making money via ads, I think it's important not to freak out too much about that because it's temporary. And if you are buying ads, this is kind of an awesome time to buy ads if you're an indie, because you don't have to work on the annual corporate budget and get approval from a bunch of different departments. You can just buy the ads right now. And so you actually might be able to get a pretty good deal on ad inventory where things are a little bit cheaper than they normally would be. So that's also worth considering. But for the most part, I think you mainly have to be aware of not releasing things too close to a holiday or a slow time or a slow weekend. But I think we're mostly past that now. As we talk about this, it's January 4th, probably coming out on the 5th. So we're past New Year's Day and like the day or two after. I think pretty much any time now, from now forward, is okay to release things without too much trouble.
Yeah, and it's just a good, in some ways, it's just a good time to get back to work, in a good way. I always find that the fall just feels just so disjointed for me. It's really hard to really get stuck into things because there's just so many things going on externally, both professionally as well as personally, that I kind of like the thought of nothing's really going to happen for the next couple of months. And so getting into a normal rhythm, getting into kind of starting some new habits, not necessarily in the have New Year's resolutions perspective, but just by benefit of there not being things that are going to be messing with your schedule. It's kind of a nice time to be able to look at that and to hopefully, I really enjoy this process of sitting down and being what do I want to work on? What is actually going to be an interesting thing to build? What I enjoy in that? And so it's a good time to be thoughtful about that and to kind of think that, what is something that's maybe the level of difficulty might be a little higher. Because it's a good time too, maybe to try and fail. If you try something that's a bit risky, that might not work out. It's a better time to do that now than, maybe later in the year or when things are a bit more high pressure. I think it was 2 or 3 Christmases ago, back when the Christmas bump was just dramatic. I remember my early days at the App Store, I would, the Christmas day and the day after Christmas were something like 8% or 10% of my yearly revenue. It was huge and dramatic.
Oh, yeah.
Thankfully, that's kind of settled down a bit. I was, as cool as it was to make that much money, it was a bit terrifying because I remember a couple of years ago, I had a bug in my main app that I released I think it was about 5-6 days before Christmas. I released it, and it turned out the bug, the app worked completely fine, except for all in-app purchases didn't work.
It worked fine, so I couldn't make any money.
Exactly. So that was a bit terrifying, and I, did the bug. It was one of these trivial things that there's just a bit of debug logic that I had to flip over, and then resubmitted to Apple, did the expedited request, and in the end, it was fine. The app was, working in a functional way on Christmas Day, which was super important. But I love that we're sort of past some of these things where you have that high stakes, that high stress, that if that app had been broken on Christmas Day, it would have had a dramatic impact. And so I love this kind of time of the year where if something gets busted, if something gets broken, the stakes are much lower. It's still impactful. It's not I want to just be cavalier about things, but it's nice to kind of have that pressure taken off a little bit and to be able to kind of really dive into some bigger projects in that way.
Oh yeah. I mean, and what you said earlier, I mean, about how this is such a great work time because there's no interruptions. I love this time of year. I mean, I hate winter in general because I can't go outside because the outside world is just hates me. But I'm a huge fan of the amount of work I can get done during this time because there's no holidays. There's very few holidays. There's no family needs really. It's just a solid couple of months really where there's nothing else to do but work, and I kind of like it. So anyway, thank you everybody for listening. Good luck getting back to work yourselves, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.